On the morning of Saturday, March 19, 2011, 22-year-old Sian O'Callaghan left Suju nightclub in Old Town, Swindon, Wiltshire, at approximately 3 a.m. after a night out with friends. She had been celebrating at the club, dancing and enjoying herself, when she decided to head home to the flat she shared with her boyfriend, Kevin Reap, in the Swindon suburbs. CCTV footage captured Sian walking along the streets of Swindon in the early morning darkness, her white jacket visible as she made her way toward what she believed would be a routine taxi ride home. But Sian O'Callaghan would never arrive at her flat that night. Instead, she climbed into a green Toyota Avensis taxi driven by 47-year-old Christopher Halliwell, a seemingly ordinary cab driver who had been prowling the streets looking for vulnerable women. Within hours, Sian was dead, murdered by Halliwell in a remote location where he left her body in a shallow grave. The investigation into her disappearance would lead police to one of Britain's most dangerous serial killers, a man who had already murdered at least one other young woman and who investigators believe may be responsible for 6 or more additional murders spanning more than 2 decades. But the case would also expose catastrophic police errors that nearly allowed Halliwell to escape justice, as a detective's decision to breach police guidelines rendered crucial confession evidence inadmissible and sparked a national debate about the balance between suspects' rights and victims' lives. Christopher John Halliwell was born in 1964 and grew up in the Swindon area of Wiltshire, England. Little is publicly known about his childhood or the factors that shaped him into a killer, but by the time he reached adulthood, Halliwell had become a taxi driver working the night shifts in Swindon. He drove a green Toyota Avensis with a distinctive yellow taxi license number displayed on the doorframe, picking up passengers from nightclubs, bars, and late-night venues across the town. To most who encountered him, Halliwell appeared unremarkable, a middle-aged man making a living driving people home after nights out. But beneath this ordinary facade was a predator who used his position as a taxi driver to identify, isolate, and murder vulnerable young women. Sian O'Callaghan was born in 1988 and grew up in Swindon, where she was known as a vibrant, outgoing young woman with a close circle of friends and a loving family. At 22 years old, she worked as an administrator and lived with her boyfriend, Kevin Reap, with whom she shared a stable and happy relationship. On the evening of Friday, March 18, 2011, Sian went out with friends to Suju nightclub in Swindon's Old Town, a popular venue for young people. She spent the evening dancing and socializing, and around 3 a.m. on Saturday, March 19, she left the club alone to head home. CCTV cameras captured her final known movements as she walked through the streets of Swindon, her white jacket clearly visible in the footage. At some point shortly after leaving the club, Sian hailed a taxi, Christopher Halliwell's green Toyota Avensis. She climbed into the back seat, expecting a routine journey home. But instead of taking her to her flat, Halliwell drove her to a remote location where he murdered her. Forensic evidence later revealed that Sian had been struck on the head with a blunt object, likely rendering her unconscious, and she had also been stabbed in the head and neck. Tests concluded she had not been sexually assaulted, but she had suffered a brutal and terrifying death at the hands of a man she had trusted to take her safely home. When Sian failed to return home that Saturday morning, her boyfriend Kevin became increasingly concerned. He tried calling and texting her, but there was no response. By Saturday afternoon, Kevin contacted Sian's family, and they jointly reported her missing to Wiltshire police. The police launched an immediate and extensive search operation, recognizing the urgency of finding a young woman who had vanished in the early morning hours. Detective Superintendent Steve Fulcher of Wiltshire Police was appointed to lead the investigation. Detectives quickly obtained CCTV footage from cameras in and around Swindon Town Center, tracing Sian's movements from the nightclub. The footage showed her walking alone and eventually entering a vehicle, a taxi. Investigators worked tirelessly to identify the vehicle, reviewing hundreds of hours of CCTV from traffic cameras, businesses, and police patrol cars equipped with dash cams. A breakthrough came when police spotted a green Toyota Avensis with a distinctive yellow square on the doorframe, a taxi license number. Further analysis revealed the vehicle belonged to Christopher Halliwell, a 47-year-old taxi driver from Swindon. Police placed Halliwell under 24-hour surveillance, deploying a 12-vehicle surveillance team and even using a police helicopter to monitor his movements. What they observed was deeply suspicious. Surveillance teams watched Halliwell meticulously clean the rear passenger seat of his taxi with chemicals. They saw him throw away car seat covers in a wheelie bin across town, far from his home. They watched him drive to remote countryside locations in the middle of the night and burn materials that investigators believe could be evidence of his crime. Halliwell's behavior indicated consciousness of guilt. He knew he had done something terrible, and he was attempting to destroy any trace of his crime. On the afternoon of Thursday, March 24, 2011, 5 days after Cyan disappeared, police made their move. Officers arrested Christopher Halliwell in the parking lot of an Asda supermarket in North Swindon on suspicion of kidnapping. The green Toyota Avensis taxi was seized for forensic examination. Halliwell was placed in a police vehicle and, according to standard procedure under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, PACE, should have been taken immediately to a police station where he would be cautioned, given access to a solicitor, and formally interviewed under controlled conditions. But Detective Superintendent Steve Fulcher made a controversial decision that would change the course of the investigation and ultimately cost him his career. Fulcher believed that Cyan O'Callaghan might still be alive, possibly being held captive somewhere by Halliwell. He felt that time was of the essence, and that if Halliwell was taken to a police station and allowed access to a solicitor, he would exercise his right to remain silent, and any chance of finding Cyan alive would be lost. Fulcher made the decision to divert the police vehicle carrying Halliwell away from the station and instead directed officers to bring Halliwell to a remote location, Barberry Castle, an Iron Age hill fort near Swindon. There, in an open field with no legal representation present, no audio recording equipment, and no formal caution, Fulcher began questioning Halliwell. Fulcher offered Halliwell cigarettes and spoke to him for hours, trying to build rapport and persuade him to reveal where Cyan was. Halliwell asked repeatedly to see a solicitor, but Fulcher refused, telling him that revealing Cyan's location was more important than his legal rights. Fulcher also warned Halliwell that he would be vilified in the press if he did not cooperate. This approach was a deliberate and fundamental breach of PACE guidelines, which exist to protect suspects' rights and ensure fair treatment within the criminal justice system. But Fulcher believed he was acting in the interests of a potential victim and that Cyan's right to life outweighed Halliwell's right to silence. Eventually, Halliwell broke. He asked Fulcher, "Do you have a car?" Fulcher confirmed that he did, and Halliwell agreed to show police where he had left Cyan. Officers drove Halliwell to a remote roadside verge near Uffington in Oxfordshire, close to the Uffington White Horse, a famous ancient landmark. There, Halliwell pointed to a shallow grave where he had buried Cyan O'Callaghan after murdering her. Cyan's body was recovered later that day, confirming the worst fears of her family and the investigation team. She had been dead since the early hours of March 19th, just hours after she climbed into Halliwell's taxi. But then, in an extraordinary development, Halliwell made an unexpected statement. As they drove away from Cyan's burial site, Halliwell turned to Fulcher and said, "Do you want another one?" Fulcher, stunned, asked what he meant. Halliwell confessed that he had killed before another young woman whose body was buried in a field in Gloucestershire. He directed officers to a location in Eastleach, Gloucestershire, where human remains were discovered 2 days later. The remains were identified as those of Rebecca Becky Godden Edwards, a 20-year-old sex worker who had disappeared from Swindon in December 2002 or early January 2003. Becky had been strangled and buried in a remote field, and for nearly 8 years, no one had known what happened to her. Fulcher believed he had achieved an incredible breakthrough. Not only had he located Cyan's body, but he had also solved a cold case and brought closure to another grieving family. But his decision to breach PACE guidelines would have devastating consequences for the prosecution. Christopher Halliwell was charged with the murders of both Cyan O'Callaghan and Becky Godden Edwards. However, his defense team immediately challenged the admissibility of his confessions, arguing that they had been obtained in violation of PACE. At a pre-trial hearing, High Court Justice Laura Cox ruled that Halliwell's confessions to both murders were inadmissible as evidence because Detective Superintendent Fulcher had breached the guidelines by failing to caution Halliwell, denying him access to a solicitor, and conducting an unrecorded interview outside of a police station. The ruling was a catastrophic blow to the prosecution. Fortunately, forensic evidence provided an alternative path to conviction for Cheyenne's murder. Tests revealed Cheyenne's blood in the rear passenger seat of Halliwell's taxi, and traces of his DNA were found on her body. This physical evidence, obtained independently of the inadmissible confession, was sufficient to proceed with charges. On October 19, 2012, Christopher Halliwell appeared at Bristol Crown Court and pleaded guilty to the murder of Cyan O'Callaghan. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum tariff of 25 years. The Court of Appeal upheld the sentence on December 14, 2012. But the case of Becky Godden was different. With the confession ruled inadmissible and no forensic evidence linking Halliwell to her murder, prosecutors had no choice but to drop the charges. Becky's family was devastated. They knew who had killed their daughter, they knew where he was, and they knew he had confessed, but he could not be prosecuted. For 5 years, Becky's family waited and hoped that new evidence would emerge. Meanwhile, Detective Superintendent Steve Fulcher faced an Independent Police Complaints Commission (IPCC) investigation into his conduct. In 2014, he was found guilty of gross misconduct and given a final written warning. Fulcher later resigned from Wiltshire Police, his career destroyed by his decision to prioritize what he believed was the victim's right to life over a suspect's right to legal representation. Fulcher has since defended his actions, arguing that PACE guidelines are flawed and do not allow police officers to act in the interests of parties whose lives are threatened. He maintains that he made the right decision and would do the same again. In the years following Halliwell's conviction for Cheyenne's murder, investigators worked painstakingly to build a new case for Becky Godden's murder, using evidence that had been overlooked or not properly investigated in 2011. An IOPC report published in September 2022 revealed significant missed opportunities during the original investigation. Among the evidence that should have been used, but was not, GP records showing that Halliwell visited a doctor in January 2003, shortly after Becky disappeared, with severe scratches to his face and damage to his hand, claiming he had been assaulted by a passenger in his taxi, but never reported the alleged assault to police. The testimony of a medical officer at Gable Cross Custody Suite, who stated on March 24, 2011, that Halliwell had told him he had been arrested for killing 2 people. A former Swindon sex worker who recognized Halliwell as one of Becky's regulars. The IOPC concluded that if this evidence had been thoroughly investigated and presented to the Crown Prosecution Service before a pre-trial hearing in 2012, it might have led to a different judicial decision, allowing Halliwell to be prosecuted for Becky's murder years earlier. On March 31, 2016, Christopher Halliwell was finally charged with the murder of Becky Godden Edwards. On September 19, 2016, after a trial at Bristol Crown Court, a jury found him guilty of murder after just 2 hours of deliberation. During the trial, Halliwell represented himself and even cross-examined former Detective Superintendent Fulcher, who had traveled to Somalia where he was working as a consultant. Halliwell claimed his confession had been false and that he had made it deliberately to destroy Fulcher's career. He said, "I wanted to do everything I could to destroy Mr. Fulcher's career." The jury did not believe him. On September 23, 2016, Justice John Griffith Williams sentenced Christopher Halliwell to life imprisonment with a whole life order for Becky's murder, meaning he would serve his sentence without the possibility of parole. Combined with his existing life sentence for Cheyenne's murder, Halliwell would die in prison. But the story did not end there. Former Detective Superintendent Steve Fulcher publicly stated his belief that Christopher Halliwell is responsible for at least 6 additional murders. Fulcher revealed that during their conversation at Barbary Castle in March 2011, Halliwell told him, "Police want to interview me about 8 murders." Fulcher concluded from this statement that Halliwell had committed other killings. Investigators have explored potential links between Halliwell and several unsolved disappearances and murders in the Swindon area and beyond, including the disappearance of Linda Razzle in 2002, but no additional charges have been filed. As of November 2025, Christopher Halliwell remains incarcerated, serving his whole life sentence. He is 61 years old and will never be released. The families of Cheyenne O'Callaghan and Becky Godden have found some measure of justice, though the pain of their losses will never fully heal. Wiltshire police formally apologized to Becky's family in September 2022 for the missed opportunities and delays in bringing her killer to justice. The case of Christopher Halliwell remains one of the most controversial in British criminal justice history, raising fundamental questions about the balance between suspects' rights and victims' lives, the limitations of PACE guidelines, and the consequences of police misconduct, even when motivated by good intentions.